Welcome back to the Bernina Skillbuilder Sewalong with sweet potato quilts. In this video, we are working on block 1 where we focus on making 4 at a time flying geese. Once you've downloaded the PDF pattern, you will find a cutting chart. I've already cut my pieces from the first document, and here you can see the pieces needed from fabrics 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and my background fabric. If you want to make a scrappy quilt, just use the piece count column in the pattern to determine the number of pieces you'll need for each block. You will also notice that every piece is assigned a letter, which you can see in the diagram above. This helps you know where each piece will end up. In this block, we are focusing on 4 at a time flying geese labeled FG1 and FG2. That means the fabric pieces we've cut for those labels will be used for the flying geese in this pattern. These are all the pieces I need for block 1, and I've pulled out all the FG squares to work with now. Take the 4 smaller squares and on the wrong side of the fabric, draw a diagonal line from corner to corner. I'm just using my acrylic ruler and a ballpoint pen. Next, set 2 of the smaller squares aside for later, but take the other 2 smaller squares and 1 larger square for FG. Place the smaller squares right sides together on opposite corners of the larger square with the diagonal line running in the same direction across both pieces. The smaller squares will overlap slightly in the center, and the diagonal line will run straight across. Pin the fabric together for stability if you'd like, and take it to your sewing machine to sew a 1/4 inch seam on both sides of the diagonal line. I'll meet you at my sewing machine. Alright, I'm at my Bernina 770 QE Plus, and I want to show you a habit of mine. And I'm just used to doing this every time because every time I sew a new seam, I always start with a leader and finish with an ender. A leader is just a scrap of fabric that I run through the machine first. This allows the bobbin thread to catch the needle thread before I start sewing my actual pieces, and I'd rather have that process happen on a scrap fabric than on my project. Once the leader is through, I sew a 1/4 inch away from the marked line. And then I finish with an ender, which becomes the leader for my next seam. I'm going to trim the threads to separate the unit from the machine, and then flip the unit and sew a 1/4 inch away from the other side of the diagonal line, again using the leader ender method. Now that both seams are sewn a 1/4 inch away from each side of the line, let's head back to the cutting mat. At this point, it's time to cut along the drawn line to separate the unit into 2 pieces. Then, I'm going to take both pieces to the pressing mat and press the triangle flaps open. Both units are now pressed with the triangle flaps up in a heart shape. Take the 2 smaller squares we set aside earlier and place one on the open corner of each unit right sides together. The diagonal line should run from top to bottom, aligned with the previous seam. Take them to the sewing machine and sew a 1/4 inch seam on both sides of each diagonal line. I'll meet you at the machine. Here I am back at the machine. I'm going to use my previous ender as a leader for this first seam. And after sewing, I chain piece the second seam right after the first without cutting threads. This saves time and keeps things efficient, especially when making multiple flying geese. After sewing your first seam, rotate each unit to sew the opposite seam, again using the leader ender method. Once both seams are sewn on each unit, I'm going to take them back to the cutting mat. Here are the 2 units, and now it's time to trim those threads. Then cut along the drawn line to separate each of them into 2 pieces each. This is the step that transforms the units into 4 flying geese. Then, press the final triangle flaps open and you will start to see your flying geese take shape. Here are my 4 flying geese, and they're not trimmed yet, so the next step is to trim each to 8.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Before trimming, we need to note that the tip of the triangle should be a 1/4 inch away from the top edge. This ensures that when you sew the unit to another piece, the point won't be cut off. That point should also be centered, landing exactly at 4.25 inches across the width. On your ruler, find the 1/4 inch line from the edge and align it with the point of the goose. That spot should also fall on the 4.25 inch mark. You also want the diagonal seams at the bottom corner to match the 4.5 inch by 8.5 inch markers on the ruler. If any fabric goes beyond that, that's great because that'll all be trimmed later. If it doesn't go beyond, then you are going to be trimming it too small. Once those points are lined up with the ruler, go ahead and trim 2 sides along the edges of the ruler. Then rotate the unit to trim the other 2 sides. And for the second trim, simply line the piece up with the 4.5 inch line and the 8.5 inch marks on the ruler and trim. If you trimmed correctly the first time around, you will notice that that point still falls 4.25 inches down from the top of the ruler and 1/4 inch in from the 4.5 inch mark. Repeat all of this by trimming all 4 flying geese down to 8.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Now here's your 4 at a time flying geese. Just know that trimming accurately is important so that you do not lose your points when these units are sewn into the block. Now let's use the pattern to sew these units into the block. Place the pieces right sides together with the point of the goose at the top. A 1/4 inch seam should intersect the point to keep it crisp. Make sure when you're at the sewing machine that your seam intersects that point. I'm going to lay out some other pieces in the pattern ready to sew, and when you go to sew these pieces together, place them right sides together so the design of the fabric is facing each other, and then sew a 1/4 inch seam and press it open. Here are 2 of the flying geese units that I've sewn together. I went ahead and pressed the seam here open, and I want to show you that when I sewed that 1/4 inch seam allowance, that stitch went through that intersection of seams so that when I press it open, you'll see that there's nice points to the unit. Here are some other pieces that I sewed right sides together, and typically my patterns assume that you will be pressing seams open unless otherwise directed in the pattern, which will lead to the nesting of seams in later steps. Typically when I press seams open, it's a really gentle step. I never move the iron in the opposite direction of the stitch. That can distort the fabric. I usually press the seams open with my fingers first, really gently, and I use my fingers to guide the iron. I never use the iron to go across the seam in this up and down motion. I just glide the iron through following my fingers. And by all means, if you have your own preferences when it comes to the directions of your seams, go for it. Now I'm just laying out all the units for block 1 so that I can get a good idea of the layout of the block, and I'm going to continue using the pattern to sew these units right sides together to complete the block. Here's the finished block, measuring 16.5 inches by 16.5 inches unfinished, which means that it'll be 16 inches square when it's ultimately sewn into the quilt. If you made it this far and completed this block with me, congratulations! We have just 8 more to go, and I'll see you soon!